The porch light was off, the house was silent, and on the coffee table sat her wedding ring beside 6 words that would destroy him. Do not look for us. He spent Christmas Eve with his mistress in Aspen while his wife discovered everything. The hidden accounts, the secret apartment, the woman he promised a future that did not include her. But here is what he never expected. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply vanished with their 8-month-old twins before sunrise. What happens next will leave you speechless. If stories about karma and justice speak to your soul, hit subscribe and stay until the end. Trust me, you will not regret it. The nursery was empty now. Meredith Caldwell stood in the doorway, holding 2 tiny Christmas stockings embroidered with snowflakes and reindeer. Her fingers traced the names stitched in silver thread. Emmett, Nora, her babies, her whole world. She whispered into the silence, her voice breaking on every word. He did not just take Christmas from us. He took everything, and I was too blind to see it coming. But that moment of reckoning came later, much later. The story begins on Christmas Eve morning, when Meredith still believed in the life she had built. The Caldwell estate in Greenwich sat like a picture from a magazine. Snow dusted the manicured hedges, wreaths hung on every window, tied with velvet ribbons the exact shade of burgundy that Eleanor Caldwell had insisted upon. Inside, a 12-foot Douglas fir dominated the living room, strung with lights and ornaments ours had collected over 3 generations of Caldwell Christmases. Meredith had been awake since 5. The twins had finally settled into a sleep schedule, and she used these quiet morning hours to prepare. She had baked gingerbread cookies from scratch. She had wrapped presents in coordinating paper with hand-tied bows. She had laid out matching family pajamas for the photo session scheduled for that afternoon. Everything had to be perfect. It always did. She stood on a step stool, reaching to adjust the angel at the top of the tree. When she heard footsteps behind her, Garrett appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his charcoal suit, his overnight bag slung over one shoulder. He looked polished, pressed, impeccable. He always did. "You are leaving already," Meredith said, stepping down carefully. "I thought your flight was not until noon." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead. Not her lips, she noticed but said nothing. "Changed my mind about driving," he said. "Roads might get icy later. Better to get ahead of it." She nodded, but something cold settled in her stomach. Garrett never changed his mind. He planned everything with military precision. She had learned that in their 6 years together. "The clients really could not reschedule?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "It is the twins' first Christmas. Garrett, they will not remember it, but I will." He sighed, the sound of a man who had answered this question too many times. "Mary, we have discussed this. The Henderson account represents $40 million in new capital. If I close this deal, we are set for years. I will be back Christmas night. I promise." She wanted to argue. She wanted to remind him that she had given up her career at his request, that she had spent the last year in a fog of sleepless nights and endless feedings, that she needed him here. But Meredith Caldwell did not argue. She accommodated. She adjusted. She made things work. "Okay," she said softly. "Just be safe." Garrett smiled, that charming smile that had won her over at a charity gala 7 years ago. He cupped her face in his hands and looked into her eyes with what she believed was genuine affection. "I will make it up to you. New Year is in Turks and Caicos. Just the 4 of us. I already booked it." She smiled back, allowing herself to believe him. "It is fine. Go close your deal." He grabbed his keys from the console table by the door. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, angled the screen away from her, and typed a quick response. "That is the client now," he said. "I need to take this in the car." She watched him walk to the door, her arms wrapped around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. "Garrett," she called out. He turned. "I love you." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just impatience. "Love you too," he said, and then he was gone. Meredith stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the fading hum of his engine. The house felt larger suddenly, emptier, despite the twins sleeping peacefully upstairs. She walked back to the tree and adjusted an ornament that did not need adjusting. Her reflection stared back at her in the darkened window. She looked tired. She looked older than 32. When had that happened? Upstairs, Nora began to cry. The sound pulled Meredith from her thong, and she climbed the stairs quickly, grateful for the distraction. In the nursery, both babies were awake now, their faces scrunched with the particular indignation of hungry infants. She lifted Nora first, then Emmett, settling them both against her chest with practiced ease. "Good morning, my loves," she murmured. "Your daddy had to work, but that is okay. We will have the best Christmas ever. Just the three of us." She meant it to sound cheerful. It came out sad. As she settled into the rocking chair to nurse them, her eyes drifted to the family portrait on the dresser. Their wedding day. Garrett looking like he had conquered the world. Meredith looking like she had won the lottery. She had thought she had won the lottery. She had thought she was the luckiest woman alive. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it awkwardly, one-handed, expecting a message from Garrett. It was from Suzanne, her best friend from college. "Merry Christmas Eve. Mama, how are the munchkins?" Meredith typed back with her thumb. "Perfect." Garrett had to fly to Aspen for work. Again. 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. Finally, the message came through. "Aspen for work in December." Something about the question made Meredith's stomach tighten. She typed back quickly. "Client meeting. Big deal. You know how it is." Suzanne's reply was immediate. "Sure. Call me later." Meredith set the phone down and focused on the twins. They nursed contentedly, their tiny fingers curling and uncurling against her skin. She breathed in their sweet baby smell and tried to push away the unease that had taken root in her chest. It was Christmas Eve. Her husband loved her. Everything was fine. She repeated it like a mantra. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. But even then, some part of her knew it was not. Christmas Eve night arrived with a gentle snowfall and absolute silence. The house felt cavernous without Garrett, every creak of the old floors amplified in the emptiness. Meredith had put the twins to bed an hour ago, singing Silent Night until her voice grew hoarse. Now she sat alone in the living room, a glass of wine untouched on the coffee table, the Christmas tree lights casting dancing shadows on the walls. She had tried calling Garrett twice. Both calls went to voicemail. She told herself he was probably at dinner with the clients. She told herself he would call when he could. She told herself 100 small lies to quiet the growing noise in her head. Her laptop sat on the ottoman where she had left it that morning, still open to the photo editing software. She had been working on the Christmas card, cropping and adjusting until the family portrait looked magazine-worthy. Now she reached for it with a different purpose. She wanted to upload the photos from the twins' first snow day to the family cloud drive. Garrett's mother had been asking for them. It was a simple task, something to occupy her hands while her mind spiraled. She opened the browser and navigated to the cloud storage. That was when she noticed something strange. Garrett's email was still logged in from when he had used her laptop last week. His inbox was visible on the screen, notifications piling up in red. Meredith hesitated. She had never checked his email before. She had never felt the need. Their marriage was built on trust, or so she had believed. But Suzanne's question kept echoing. Aspen for work. In December, she clicked on the inbox. The first email she saw was a confirmation from the Sterling Resort and Spa in Aspen. Her heart began to pound as she opened it. Romantic getaway package for 2. Check-in December 24th. Check-out December 26th. Suite reserved under Garrett Caldwell. Guest name Vanessa Holt. The words blurred on the screen. Meredith blinked rapidly, certain she had misread. She scrolled down. More emails. Months of them. Restaurant reservations for 2. Jewelry purchases from stores she did not recognize. A lease agreement for an apartment in Tribeca. Signed 6 months ago. Her hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the laptop. She set it aside and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to breathe, trying to think. There had to be an explanation. Garrett would never. He loved her. He told her every day, but her hands kept moving. She opened a new tab and typed the name into the search bar. Vanessa Holt. The first result was a LinkedIn profile. Executive assistant to Garrett Caldwell. Caldwell Capital Management. The profile photo showed a woman in her late 20s with sleek dark hair and a confident smile. Meredith clicked through to her Instagram. Public profile. Recent posts. The most recent one had been uploaded just hours ago. It showed a champagne flute held against a backdrop of snow-covered mountains. The caption read, "Some gifts are worth waiting for," followed by a diamond emoji. Meredith zoomed in on the photo. The woman's wrist was visible, adorned with a delicate bracelet. Meredith recognized it immediately. She had admired it in a store window 6 months ago, had mentioned it to Garrett. He had said it was too expensive. She scrolled back further. Photos of restaurant tables, hotel suites, city skylines, and in the reflection of one window, barely visible but unmistakably there, was Garrett's face. Have you ever discovered something that changed your life forever? Comment truth if you have been through something like this. Meredith's wineglass sat forgotten as she descended deeper into the evidence of her husband's betrayal. She found credit card statements linked to an account she had never known existed. She found text messages forwarded to email, conversations so intimate they made her physically ill. One exchange stood out. It was dated 3 weeks ago, the day before Thanksgiving. Vanessa had written, "When are you going to leave her?" Garrett had replied, "After the holidays. I need to protect my assets first. She does not suspect a thing." Meredith read those words again and again until they stopped making sense. She does not suspect a thing. The woman in the photo, the apartment in Tribeca. The lies stacked so high they blocked out the sun. She picked up her phone with trembling fingers and called Garrett. He answered on the third ring, his voice annoyed. "What is it? I am in the middle of something." In the background, she could hear music, laughter, a woman's voice saying something she could not quite make out. "Who is there with you, Karen?" Meredith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Colleagues," Garrett said dismissively. "Do not be paranoid. Mary, I will call you tomorrow." "Garrett, I need to talk to you about something." He sighed heavily. "Whatever it is, it can wait. I am dealing with important people right now. More important than your wife." She wanted to scream, "More important than your children." But the words stuck in her throat. She heard the woman laugh again, closer this time, and something inside her cracked. Garrett said, "Oyen, I have to go. Merry Christmas." The line went dead. Meredith sat perfectly still for a long moment. The Christmas tree lights blinked on and off in their programmed rhythm, oblivious to the destruction unfolding before them. Then she stood, walked upstairs, and entered the nursery. The twins slept peacefully in their cribs, their faces soft and untroubled. She lowered herself to the floor between them and pulled her knees to her chest. The tears came then, silent and relentless. She cried until her body ached, until she had nothing left. She cried for the marriage she thought she had, for the man she thought she knew, for the future she had imagined, now dissolving like snow on warm pavement. When the crying finally stopped, something else took its place. Not grief, not anger, clarity. She reached for her phone and dialed Suzanne's number. Her friend answered on the first ring. "Mary, what is wrong?" Meredith's voice came out steady, steadier than she felt. "I need your help. Garrett has been lying to me about everything." Suzanne arrived at the Greenwich Estate before dawn on Christmas morning, her car packed with essentials and her legal mind already working through the options. She had not slept after Meredith's call. Neither had Meredith. They sat at the kitchen table while the twins still slept, speaking in hushed voices as the first gray light of Christmas Day seeped through the windows. "Show me everything you found," Suzanne said, her tone all business despite the early hour. Meredith slid the laptop across the table. She had spent the night downloading files, screenshotting conversations, building a dossier of her husband's betrayal. It was not the Christmas she had imagined, but it was the Christmas that would save her life. Suzanne scrolled through the evidence in silence, her expression growing darker with each revelation. The apartment lease, the jewelry receipts, the text messages planning a future that did not include Meredith. Finally, she looked up. "This is bad. This is really bad." "I know." "No. Mary, you do not understand. These financial transfers, he is hiding money, a lot of money. If he is planning what I think he is planning, you need to move fast." Meredith wrapped her hands around a mug of cold coffee. "What do you mean?" "Planning," Suzanne leaned forward. "Men like Garrett do not just leave. They prepare, they position themselves to come out on top. By the time the wife finds out, all the money is gone, the prenup is airtight, and she is left with nothing." "We did not have a prenup," Meredith said quietly. "He said he trusted me." Suzanne's laugh was bitter. Of course he said that. He knew exactly what he was doing. A prenup would have protected you. Without one, he can claim whatever he wants in the divorce. But it also means you are entitled to half of everything. If you can prove it exists. Meredith stared at the evidence on the screen. So what do I do? Suzanne did not hesitate. You leave today. Right now. Before he comes back and realizes you know. Leave and go where my family has a cabin in Vermont. It has been empty for years. No paper trail. No one knows about it except family. Meredith shook her head slowly. I cannot just disappear with the twins. That is kidnapping. It is not kidnapping if you are their mother and there is no custody order in place. You have every right to take your children wherever you want. What you do not have is time. The words hung in the air between them. Meredith looked around the kitchen she had designed herself, at the custom cabinets and marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. She had built this home. She had made it beautiful. But it had never really been hers. If I leave, she said slowly, everything changes. There is no going back. Suzanne reached across the table and took her hand. Do you want to go back to a man who has been lying to you for months, who has another woman waiting in an apartment you did not know existed? Meredith thought about Garrett's face in that reflected window, the champagne, the diamond bracelet. She thinks about his voice on the phone, annoyed and dismissive, treating her like an inconvenience. No, she whispered. I do not want to go back. Then we need to move. They worked quickly and quietly. Meredith packed the essentials, following Suzanne's precise instructions: birth certificates, passports, social security cards, the twins' medical records, her grandmother's jewelry, the only thing that was hers alone. She did not pack clothes, she did not pack memories. She packed only what mattered. Suzanne handled the logistics, cash withdrawal from an ATM using Meredith's personal account, one Garrett rarely monitored, a burner phone purchased at a convenience store, a route planned through back roads to avoid any possible surveillance. As Meredith loaded the last bag into her car, she paused in the doorway of the living room. The Christmas tree still glowed, its lights blinking in their endless, programmed rhythm. The stockings still hung above the fireplace. The presents she had wrapped so carefully still waited beneath the tree. She walked to the coffee table and removed her wedding ring, set it on the smooth wooden surface. Then she took a piece of paper from the notepad by the phone and wrote 6 words. Do not look for us. She placed it beside the ring and turned away. The twins were bundled into their car seats, still drowsy from sleep. Emmett grabbed at her finger as she buckled him in. Nora yawned and closed her eyes again. Meredith kissed both of their foreheads. We are going on an adventure, she whispered. Just the 3 of us. She climbed into the driver's seat and looked at Suzanne through the window. You are sure about the cabin, Suzanne nodded. I will send you the coordinates. Do not use your regular phone. Do not contact anyone from your old life. I will handle things on this end. Meredith nodded. Thank you. For everything. You can thank me when you are free. Meredith started the engine. She looked once more at the house she had called home for 4 years. The perfect house for a perfect life that had been nothing but a lie. Then she drove away into the gray Christmas morning, leaving everything behind except the only 2 people who had ever truly needed her. Behind her, the snow began to fall again, covering her tracks as if she had never been there at all. Garrett Caldwell arrived home on Christmas night to find the porch light dark and the house silent. He noticed immediately. Meredith always left the light on for him. It was one of her small rituals, the kind she insisted upon despite his indifference. But tonight the porch was shrouded in shadow, and something cold settled in his chest as he bolted into the driveway. The flight from Aspen had been uncomfortable. Turbulence bouncing the small plane through snow clouds while Garrett nursed a champagne hangover and thought about the weekend he had left behind. Vanessa had been disappointed when he insisted on leaving early. She had wanted him to stay through New Year's. But appearances mattered, and Garrett Caldwell always maintained appearances. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The Christmas tree still glowed in the living room, its lights casting dancing shadows on walls that felt too quiet. Meredith, he called. I am home. Silence answered him. He set down his bag and walked into the living room. Everything was in place. The decorations, the presents, the throw pillows arranged just so. Then he saw the coffee table. Her wedding ring sat beside a folded piece of paper, catching the light from the tree. Garrett picked up the note with fingers that had begun to tremble. Do not look for us. He read the words 3 times before they registered. Then he dropped the paper and ran upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. The nursery was empty. The cribs stood like silent accusations, blankets folded neatly. No sign of the twins who should have been sleeping there. He threw open dresser drawers, finding them half empty. The diaper bag was gone. The baby carriers were gone. He pulled out his phone and dialed Meredith's number. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. He called again. Same result. His hands shook as he scrolled through his contacts and dialed his mother. Eleanor answered on the second ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. Garrett, is something wrong? She is gone, he said, the words coming out strangled. Meredith, she took the twins and she is gone. A pause, then Eleanor's voice turned hard. What do you mean gone? I came home and she was not here. She left her ring and a note saying not to look for her. The babies are gone too, I see. Eleanor's tone was the kind of cold that preceded hurricanes. What did you do? Garrett, nothing. I do not know why she would. Do not lie to me. I am not your wife. Garrett sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He thought about the emails, the text messages, the evidence he had been so careful to hide. She found out, he said finally, about Vanessa. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice could have frozen water. You stupid, stupid boy. I warned you about that woman. I had it under control. Clearly you did not. Do you have any idea where Meredith might have gone? Garrett tried to think through the panic. Her parents were dead. She had few friends. Suzanne Brennan had been her maid of honor at the wedding, but Meredith rarely mentioned her anymore. Maybe Suzanne died. He said, they were close in college. Then find Suzanne and find out what she knows. I will make some calls. We need to get ahead of this before it becomes a scandal. Garrett nodded even though his mother could not see him. He felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not guilt, not remorse. Anger. How dare she leave? How dare she take his children and disappear without giving him a chance to explain, without letting him manage the situation? He had given her everything, the house, the status, the comfortable life, and this was how she repaid him, Mother, he said, his voice hardening. I want them found, whatever it takes. Eleanor's response was immediate. I know people, discreet people. We will handle this. After he hung up, Garrett sat alone in the empty nursery, surrounded by the artifacts of a family that no longer existed. The mobile above Emmett's crib swayed slightly in the draft from the heating vent, playing a tinkling melody that made his jaw clench. He picked up his phone again and made one more call. Vanessa answered breathlessly. Baby, I thought you were not calling until tomorrow. Change of plans, Garrett said flatly. She knows. She took the kids and ran. A pause. Oh God, what are we going to do? You are going to stay quiet and let me handle this. Do you understand? Yes. Of course. Whatever you need. Garrett hung up without saying goodbye. He walked back downstairs and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, downing it in one burning swallow. Meredith thought she could escape him. She thought she could take his children and disappear into the night like he was some ordinary man she could simply leave behind. She was wrong. Garrett Caldwell did not lose. Not in business, not in life, not in marriage. He picked up his phone and made one final call, this time to a man who specialized in finding people who did not want to be found. I need your services, he said. My wife has taken our children. I need to know where she is within 48 hours. The man on the other end quoted a price. Garrett did not hesitate. Done, whatever it takes. He hung up and stared at the Christmas tree, its cheerful lights suddenly obscene in the wreckage of his perfect life. She would learn. They all learned eventually. Nobody walked away from Garrett Caldwell. The cabin in Vermont sat at the end of a dirt road that had not been plowed in years. Snow buried the driveway up to the wheel wells, forcing Meredith Faye to park 50 yards from the front door and carry the twins through knee-deep drifts. By the time she got them inside, her legs ached and her lungs burned from the cold. But the cabin was solid, dry, safe. Suzanne's family had owned this property for 3 generations. It was rustic, with no Wi-Fi and spotty cell reception, but it had running water, a working fireplace, and enough canned goods in the pantry to last weeks. Meredith set the twins down on a worn couch and looked around at her new life. The first 3 days passed in a blur of feeding schedules and sleepless nights, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made thinking impossible. She kept the curtains drawn. She jumped at every sound. She checked the locks obsessively before bed, but slowly, incrementally, something began to shift. On the fourth morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains and the sound of Emmett laughing in his portable crib. Nora was awake too, babbling contentedly at the ceiling. Meredith lay still for a moment, listening to her children exist in this quiet, hidden place. For the first time in months, she felt something she almost did not recognize. Peace. Suzanne arrived that afternoon, her car loaded with supplies and legal documents. She stomped the snow off her boots and pulled Meredith into a tight hug before saying a word. "You look better," she said finally. "Less like a ghost." "I feel better. It is strange. I thought I would fall apart out here." Suzanne set a stack of folders on the kitchen table. "That is because you have been falling apart for years. You just did not notice because you were too busy holding everything else together." They sat at the table while the twins napped, spreading documents across the scarred wooden surface. Suzanne had been busy. Bank records showing hidden accounts, property deeds. Meredith had never seen evidence of financial fraud that went far beyond simple infidelity. "He has been moving money offshore for over a year," Suzanne explained. "Shell companies in the Caymans, investments that do not appear on any joint statements. If he files for divorce tomorrow, he will claim he has nothing. You would walk away with pennies." Meredith stared at the numbers. "How much are we talking about?" "Best estimate, 12 to 15 million. Hidden." The amount was staggering. Meredith had known they were wealthy. She had not known they were this wealthy. "There is more," Suzanne said carefully. "I did some digging into Vanessa Holt. She is not just his assistant. She has been on his payroll for 3 years at a salary that does not match any job description I can find." "What do you mean?" "I mean she is getting paid for something other than scheduling his meetings. And based on the apartment lease, I think she has been waiting for him to leave you for a long time." Meredith felt sick. All those business trips, all those late nights at the office. She had trusted him completely, and he had used that trust like a weapon against her. "What do we do?" she asked. "We build a case," Suzanne replied. "We document everything, and when the time is right, we bury him in court." For the first time since Christmas Eve, Meredith felt something other than fear and grief. She felt the first stirring of anger, hot and clarifying. She looked at the evidence spread across the table. Then she looked at Suzanne. "Tell me what you need from me." They worked for hours, organizing documents and outlining a strategy. Suzanne explained the legal options in terms Meredith could understand: divorce proceedings, asset discovery, custody considerations. By the time they finished, the sun had set and the twins were awake again, hungry and demanding attention. Meredith fed them while Suzanne made dinner from the canned goods in the pantry. Later, with the baby settled and the fire crackling low, they sat together in the quiet darkness. "I thought I would miss him," Meredith admitted. "The house, the life. But I do not." "You miss the idea of what it was supposed to be," Suzanne said, "not what it actually was." Meredith nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, all the times I told myself I was being paranoid or ungrateful. That is not your fault. He was good at lying. He really was." They were silent for a moment. Then Suzanne said, "You know he is looking for you. His mother has connections, money, resources." "I know." "Are you scared?" Meredith considered the question. She thought about Garrett's face, the cold calculation in his eyes. She thought about his mother, who had never liked her, who had always treated her like an inconvenience. "Yes," she said finally, "but I am more scared of going back." "Good. Hold on to that." Outside, the snow fell silently, burying the world in white. Meredith looked at her children sleeping peacefully in the portable crib Suzanne had brought, and she allowed herself for the first time to imagine a future that did not include Garrett Caldwell. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It felt like freedom. She whispered into the darkness, just loud enough for herself to hear. "We are going to be okay." She almost believed it. The sound of car engines woke Meredith from a dead sleep. It was 3 in the morning, a week after Christmas, and the world outside the cabin should have been silent. Instead, headlights cut through the darkness. sweeping across the bedroom ceiling like searchlights hunting for prey. Meredith was on her feet before she was fully awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cold floorboards sent shivers up her legs as she ran to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. Two vehicles. Two, a black SUV and what looked like a police cruiser. They had stopped at the end of the buried driveway, and figures were emerging into the snow. Their breath rose in white clouds against the dark sky. No, not now. Not yet. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called Suzanne. It rang once, twice, three times. Voicemail. She tried again, her fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped the phone. Same result. The figures were moving toward the cabin now, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like surgical instruments. Meredith counted four of them. Two in uniform, two in civilian clothes. Their footsteps crunched through the frozen snow, each sound driving a spike of panic deeper into her chest. She had maybe 3 minutes. She ran to the twins, still sleeping peacefully in their cribs, and began the impossible calculus of escape. There was no back door, no second exit, no window large enough to climb through with two infants, no way out that did not lead directly past the people approaching. Think, think, think. Her mind raced through options that did not exist. She could hide in the closet. They would find her. She could refuse to open the door. They would break it down. She could fight against four people, two of them armed, a knock on the door, sharp and authoritative. The sound echoed through the small cabin like a gunshot. Mrs. Caldwell. This is the police. Open up. Meredith stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, her babies in her arms, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Emmett stirred against her chest, disturbed by her racing heartbeat. Nora whimpered softly in her sleep. She could not run. She could not hide. She could only wait. Another knock, harder this time. Mrs. Caldwell, we know you are in there. Open the door or we will be forced to enter. Meredith walked slowly toward the door, each step feeling like a march toward execution. She shifted the twins to one arm and reached for the handle with a hand that would not stop shaking. The door opened. Eleanor Caldwell stepped inside first, wrapped in a cashmere coat the color of fresh cream and wearing an expression of cold triumph. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like a woman who had never been inconvenienced by anything in her life. Behind her came two uniformed officers, their faces professionally blank, and a man Meredith did not recognize. He was heavy-set with a shaved head and expressionless eyes that scanned the cabin with practiced efficiency. Did you really think you could hide from us? Eleanor said, her voice dripping with contempt. In a cabin owned by your college roommate's family, we found you in 3 days. Meredith, 3 days. Did you honestly believe you could outsmart us? Meredith clutched the twins tighter, their warmth the only thing anchoring her to reality. How did you, money, dear. Money finds everything. Eleanor's smile was a blade, sharp and merciless. My son has filed for emergency custody. These officers are here to ensure you comply with the court order. Court order? What court order? I have not been served with anything. One of the officers stepped forward, holding out a sheaf of papers. His badge glinted in the dim light. Mrs. Caldwell, your husband has obtained an emergency custody ruling based on concerns about your mental stability and the safety of the children. You are required to appear in Connecticut court, so within 72 hours. Mental stability. Meredith's voice cracked. That is insane. I am their mother, but yet I have never done anything to hurt them. A mother who fled in the middle of the night with 2 infants. Eleanor interjected smoothly. Who abandoned her home without explanation. Who took her children to an isolated location where no one could reach them. That is not the behavior of a stable person, Meredith. That is the behavior of someone experiencing a psychological breakdown. I found out he was cheating on me, Meredith shouted, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. He has been having an affair for months. He has been hiding money, lying about everything. I left to protect myself and my children. Eleanor did not blink. Her expression remained perfectly composed, perfectly controlled. You see, officers, paranoid delusions, persecution fantasies, just as we described in the petition. The heavy-set man spoke for the first time, his voice flat and professional. Mrs. Caldwell, I am Frank Donovan, private investigator. Your husband hired me to locate you and the children. This does not have to be difficult. Come back peacefully. Cooperate with the legal process, and we can sort this out through proper channels." Meredith looked at him, at the officers, at Eleanor. She searched their faces for any sign of sympathy, any hint that they might believe her. She found nothing. Only cold certainty, only power, only the absolute confidence of people who knew they had already won. "What choice do I have?" she whispered. "You have 72 hours to appear in Connecticut court," the officer repeated. "If you fail to appear, you will be arrested for custodial interference. Your children will be placed in their father's care pending the hearing." Meredith felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. Everything she had built in the past week, the safety, the hope, the fragile dream of freedom, gone. All of it gone in the span of a few minutes. Eleanor stepped closer, her perfume expensive and suffocating in the small space. Her voice dropped to a poisonous whisper that only Meredith could hear. "Come home quietly, and maybe Garrett will be merciful. Make this difficult. Fight us in court. Drag this into the public eye, and I will personally ensure you never see those babies again. Do you understand me?" Meredith looked down at Emmett and Nora, their faces peaceful in sleep despite the chaos surrounding them. They had no idea that their futures were being decided by people who saw them as possessions rather than people. She thought about fighting. She thought about running. She thought about screaming until anyone, believed her. But Eleanor was right. Money found everything, and Meredith had nothing. No resources, no connections, no power. "Fine," she said, the words scraping her throat like broken glass. "I will come back." Eleanor smiled that razor smile. "I knew you would see reason. You always were a practical girl." As the officers supervised her packing, as Donovan loaded her bags into the SUV, as Eleanor cooed over the twins like they were prizes she had won at an auction, Meredith made a silent vow. This was not over. She had lost this battle, but the war had just begun. And she would burn everything to the ground before she let them take her children. The Greenwich family courthouse was a gray stone building with tall windows and American flags hanging limp in the January cold. Inside, marble floors echoed with footsteps and hushed voices, and the air smelled of old paper and institutional cleaning products. Meredith sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Suzanne was beside her, reviewing documents with barely contained fury. "This is wrong," Suzanne muttered. "Judge Harrison Webb has been a family friend of the Caldwells for 30 years. He was at their wedding. For God's sake, he should recuse himself." "He will not," Meredith said flatly. "They have thought of everything. I can file a motion. It will be denied. Then we appeal." "With what money?" "Suze, I have nothing." He froze all the accounts. Suzanne looked at her friend, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Meredith saw doubt in her eyes. Real fear about what they were up against. The courtroom doors opened. A bailiff stepped out and called their case number. Meredith stood on shaking legs and walked toward her fate. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected, intimate in a way that felt threatening. Garrett sat at the opposite table with his attorney, a woman named Pamela Thornton, whose reputation preceded her like a warning. She was known for destroying opposing parties with surgical precision. Garrett did not look at Meredith. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his posture straight, his expression the perfect portrait of a wronged husband. Behind him sat Eleanor, watching with the cold satisfaction of a snake that had cornered its prey. And beside Eleanor, dressed in modest professional attire that somehow made her look even more beautiful, sat Vanessa Holt. The sight of her nearly made Meredith stumble. She was here, in this courtroom, watching Meredith fight for her children while wearing the evidence of her affair like a trophy. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Webb. The judge entered, a white-haired man with steel-rimmed glasses and an expression that suggested he had already made his decision. He nodded toward Pamela Thornton before even glancing at Meredith's table. "We are here today to address the emergency custody petition filed by Garrett Caldwell regarding the minor children, Emmett and Nora Caldwell. Mrs. Thornton, please proceed." Pamela stood, her voice smooth and confident. "Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about the welfare of his children. On December 25th, his wife Meredith Caldwell fled the family home in the middle of the night, taking the children to an unknown location without notice or communication. Meredith wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell them all the truth about the affair, about the hidden money, about the years of lies. But Suzanne gripped her arm, a warning to stay silent. We have obtained a psychiatric evaluation, Pamela continued, holding up a document, suggesting that Mrs. Caldwell may be experiencing postpartum psychosis. The evaluating physician, Dr. Robert Matthews, is prepared to testify that her behavior is consistent with delusional thinking and potential danger to the children. Meredith leaned toward Suzanne. I have never seen that doctor in my life, she whispered urgently. I know. We will object. But when Suzanne raised the objection, Judge Webb dismissed it with a wave of his hand. The evaluation was conducted at the request of Mr. Caldwell out of concern for his children. It is admissible. The next hour was a blur of testimony and accusations. Vanessa took the stand as a character witness, introducing herself as Mr. Caldwell's executive assistant and describing her observations of Meredith's increasingly erratic behavior over the past year. She seemed paranoid. Vanessa said, her voice dripping with false concern. She accused Mr. Caldwell of things that simply were not true. I witnessed several outbursts at company events. Meredith stared at the woman who had been sleeping with her husband, who was now lying under oath to take her children, and felt something inside her go cold. When Suzanne tried to present evidence of the affair, Judge Webb cut her off. This is a custody hearing, Mrs. Brennan, not a divorce proceeding. Mr. Caldwell's personal relationships are not relevant to the welfare of the children. Your Honor, with respect, his dishonesty goes directly to his character and fitness as a parent. Objection sustained. Move on. There was nowhere to move. Every piece of evidence Meredith had gathered was dismissed or excluded. Every argument Suzanne made was overruled. The outcome had been decided before they ever walked through the door. The ruling came swift and devastating. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Webb announced, I am granting temporary custody of the minor children to Mr. Garrett Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell will be permitted supervised visitation twice weekly, pending a full custody hearing. No. Meredith rose to her feet. No. You cannot do this. He is lying. They are all lying. Mrs. Caldwell, you will compose yourself or you will be removed from this courtroom. Please, please, they are my babies. I am their mother. But the bailiffs were already moving toward her, and Garrett was standing, and Eleanor was reaching for the twins in their carrier, and Meredith watched helplessly as her children were carried out of the courtroom by the people who had stolen everything from her. Nora looked back over Eleanor's shoulder, her face scrunched with confusion, reaching toward her mother with tiny outstretched hands. Meredith collapsed against Suzanne, the sound that escaped her throat barely human. She had lost. They had taken everything, and there was nothing she could do. The motel room smelled of mildew and despair. Wallpaper peeled in the corners like dead skin, and the carpet bore stains Meredith did not want to examine. A watermark spread across the ceiling above the bed, shaped vaguely like a map of somewhere she would never go. But the room was $39 a night, and she had exactly $847 left to her name. 3 weeks had passed since the custody hearing. 3 weeks of supervised visits in sterile visitation rooms with fluorescent lighting and plastic furniture, where she was allowed to hold her own children for exactly 2 hours while a court-appointed monitor watched her every move. 3 weeks of sleeping in cheap motels that accepted cash and did not ask questions. 3 weeks of eating gas station food and drinking vending machine coffee and trying to find a way forward when every road was blocked. Garrett's lawyers had been thorough. They had frozen the joint accounts, citing concerns about financial stability. They had challenged her access to the house, claiming it was now a matter for the divorce proceedings. They had successfully argued that her fleeing the state demonstrated poor judgment. They had systematically dismantled every safety net she had ever known, brick by brick, until there was nothing left. And today had brought the worst news yet. Meredith sat on the edge of the sagging bed, staring at the documents Suzanne had couriered to her that morning. The envelope sat open on the nightstand, its contents spread across the faded bedspread like evidence at a crime scene. Bettina Marshall, Garrett's former secretary and their star witness, had recanted her testimony. In a sworn statement, she now claimed that Meredith had coerced her into making false allegations against Miss Caldwell. The document was professionally typed, legally binding, and absolutely devastating. He bought her off. Suzanne had said on the phone, her voice heavy with defeat. I do not know how much he paid her, but it was enough. She was our best chance at proving the financial fraud. What about the federal case transfer denied? Judge Webb stayed on the case, And the ethics complaint is going nowhere. His connections run too deep. Mary, I have never seen anything like this. So what now? The silence on the other end of the line had lasted too long. I do not know. I am running out of options. I am so sorry. Meredith had hung up and sat in silence for what felt like hours. Outside her window, life continued as if the world had not ended. Cars passed on the highway, their headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. A neon sign flickered for a diner across the street, advertising coffee and pie. Somewhere out there, someone was living a normal life, worrying about normal problems, holding their children without a stranger watching. She picked up her phone and opened the news app, scrolling mindlessly through headlines she did not care about. Then the first story made her stomach turn. Caldwell Capital reports record quarter. Firm announces expansion plans. The photo showed Garrett at a press conference, standing behind a podium bearing his company's logo. He looked confident and successful and utterly untouched by the destruction he had caused. His suit was impeccable. His smile was radiant. He looked like a man who had never lost anything in his life. And beside him stood Vanessa, her hand resting protectively on a barely visible bump beneath her designer dress. She was glowing, the way pregnant women were supposed to glow, the way Meredith had glowed, once, before everything fell apart. The caption read, Caldwell with fiancée Vanessa Holt, expecting their first child together. Meredith read the words again, expecting their first child, as if Emmett and Nora did not exist, as if they were footnotes in Garrett's story rather than the center of hers. She thought about her baby sleeping in Eleanor's house tonight, being fed by nannies and held by strangers. She thought about the 2 hours a week she was permitted to spend with them, supervised and scrutinized and never enough. She thought about giving up. Her phone rang, startling her from the spiral. Unknown number. She almost did not answer. What was the point? More bad news, more lawyers telling her there was nothing they could do. More evidence that the world belonged to people like Garrett, and she was just living in it, but something made her thumb swipe across the screen. Is this Meredith Caldwell? The voice was female, cautious, unfamiliar. There was an echo on the line, like the caller was somewhere large and empty. Who is this? My name is not important right now, but I have something that might be. If this is another reporter looking for a story, I am not interested. I have nothing to say. I am not a reporter. Mrs. Weddle Caldwell. I am someone who has been where you are now. Someone who survived Garrett Caldwell. Meredith's breath caught. Her hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles turned white. What are you talking about? A pause. When the woman spoke again, her voice was softer, laden with the weight of old pain. Check your email. I sent you something that will change everything. But be careful. He has people watching you. He always has people watching. How did you get this number? Who are you? Someone who refused to disappear. Read the email. Then call me back. The line went dead. Meredith sat motionless for a long moment, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then, with trembling hands, she opened her email. There was one new message. No subject line, no greeting, no explanation. Just an attachment and a single line of text. He did this to me too. You are not crazy. You are not alone. She opened the attachment. The first document was a psychiatric commitment form from 4 years ago. Patient named Colleen Mercer. Admitted by husband, Garrett Mercer, on grounds of severe depression and delusional behavior. Involuntary hold. Meredith's heart stopped. Garrett had been married before. Eleanor had mentioned it once, dismissively, years ago at a family dinner. A brief marriage that ended tragically when his first wife died in a car accident. Such a shame, Eleanor had said, but some people are simply too fragile for this world. But Colleen Mercer had not died in a car accident. According to these documents, she had been committed to a psychiatric facility by her husband without her consent, held for 6 months, sedated, isolated, released only after agreeing to sign away all claims to marital assets and promising never to contact Garrett or his family again. And then she had simply vanished. Meredith scrolled through the rest of the files with growing horror. Medical records showing treatments she had never consented to, financial documents revealing hidden accounts, court filings that had been sealed and buried, and a letter from Colleen to her sister, never sent, folded into the digital file like evidence. He told everyone I was crazy. The letter read, he had doctors who believed him, judges who owed him favors, lawyers who did whatever he wanted. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He had taken everything. My money, my reputation, my sanity, my identity. If you are reading this, it means I finally escaped. Please do not let him do this to anyone else. Meredith looked at the date on the documents. 4 years ago, Colleen Mercer had escaped Garrett Caldwell. She had survived. She had rebuilt her life from the ashes of everything he destroyed, which meant Meredith could too. She picked up her phone and dialed the unknown number. It rang once before connecting. "I am listening," Meredith said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Tell me everything." The woman on the other end of the line called herself Catherine now. Though that was not her real name, she had shed Colleen Mercer like a snake sheds its skin, leaving that identity behind along with everything Garrett had touched. She lived off the grid, she explained, in a small town in Oregon where nobody knew her history. She had spent 4 years rebuilding her life from nothing, learning to trust again, learning to exist without constantly looking over her shoulder. But she had never forgotten what Garrett did to her. And when she saw the news about his custody battle, about his new wife who had fled with their children, she knew she could not stay silent anymore. "I have been building a case against him for years," Catherine said, "collecting evidence, documenting everything, but I was too afraid to go to the authorities on my own. Why contact me now? Because you are the first woman who fought back. Everyone before you just disappeared. I thought maybe, together, we could be strong enough to bring him down." They talked for 3 hours that first night. Catherine walked Meredith through the evidence she had gathered, the patterns she had identified, the network of corruption that protected Garrett Caldwell from consequences. "There was a woman before me, too," Catherine revealed. Her name was Patricia. She lasted 2 years before he had her committed. And before Patricia, there was a girl he dated in college. She dropped out and moved across the country. Never told anyone why. How many women has he done this to that I know of? At least 4. But I suspect there are more. Meredith felt sick. All those years, all those victims, and Garrett had never faced a single consequence. His money and connections had protected him, turned predation into a pattern, transformed abuse into a system. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to the one person who has been trying to catch him for years." 2 days later, Meredith sat in a nondescript office building in Hartford, facing a woman named Patricia Cole. She was an FBI agent with sharp eyes and a tired expression, the kind of person who had seen too much to be easily surprised. "Mrs. Caldwell," Agent Cole said, "I have been building a case against your husband for 6 years. Securities fraud, tax evasion, obstruction of justice. But every time I get close, witnesses disappear or recant. Evidence goes missing. Judges rule in his favor. So you know he is guilty. I know he is dangerous. And I know he has powerful friends who protect him. Then why have you not arrested him?" Agent Cole leaned forward. "Because knowing something and proving something in court are two different things. I need testimony. Witnesses willing to go on record. And until now, everyone has been too afraid." Meredith thought about Emmett and Nora, about the 2 hours a week she was permitted to spend with them, about Eleanor's smug smile and Vanessa's hand on her pregnant belly. "I am not afraid anymore," she said. They spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Agent Cole coordinated with Catherine, piecing together decades of evidence into a comprehensive case. Meredith wore a wire to her supervised visits, capturing conversations that revealed Garrett's true nature. But the trap they set was elegant in its simplicity. Meredith would reach out to Garrett directly. She would pretend to surrender, to beg for a private meeting where they could discuss the terms of her capitulation. His ego would not allow him to refuse. And when he arrived, confident and gloating, expecting a broken woman begging for scraps, he would find something else entirely. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a hotel in Stamford. Meredith chose the location carefully, a suite with good acoustics and multiple hidden cameras. She arrived early, her heart pounding, but her resolve absolute. Agent Cole was positioned in the adjacent room with a team of agents, monitoring every word. When Garrett walked through the door, he looked exactly as she remembered. Polished, confident, untouchable. "You wanted to talk," he said, settling into a chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never lost. "So talk." Meredith sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "I want to see my children," she said softly. "I miss them so much." "Then stop fighting. Come home. Accept your place." "My place," Garrett smiled, the smile that had once charmed her, that had made her feel special and chosen and lucky. But now she saw it for what it was, a mask, a weapon. "You are never going to be more than what I made you," he said. "A pretty face, a good mother, a wife who stayed home and did not ask questions. But you got greedy. Mary, you started wanting things you did not deserve, like honesty, like control. And control is not something I give away." Meredith felt the wire against her skin, recording every word. "What about Colleen?" she asked quietly. "Did she want control too?" The change in Garrett's expression was instantaneous. The mask slipped, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath. "Who told you that name? I found out about her. Garrett. About what you did." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Colleen was weak. Just like you. She could not handle reality. So I helped her disappear. And if you keep pushing, the same thing will happen to you." "Is that a threat? It is a promise?" Meredith nodded slowly. Then she looked directly into the mirror on the wall, where she knew the camera was hidden. "I think we have everything we need," she said. The door burst open. Agents poured into the room. And for the first time in his life, Garrett Caldwell looked genuinely afraid. The arrest of Garrett Caldwell made headlines across the country. News cameras captured him being led out of the Stanford Hotel in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The images played on every channel, shared across every social media platform, dissected by every cable news commentator. Hedge fund manager arrested on multiple federal charges. FBI takes down Wall Street. Predator. Women come forward in Caldwell case. The charges were extensive. Securities fraud, tax evasion, falsifying psychiatric commitments, conspiracy to deprive civil rights. And when Catherine came forward, followed by Patricia and two other women, Meredith had never known existed. The case became something larger than any single prosecution. It became a reckoning. Agent Cole had warned Meredith that the legal process would be slow, that there would be hearings and depositions and appeals, that Garrett's lawyers would fight every charge with every resource at their disposal. But some battles were won before they even went to trial. 3 days after the arrest, Vanessa Holt was photographed trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with $200,000 in jewelry and a suitcase full of cash. She was stopped by customs, arrested for receiving stolen property, and perp walked through the airport in the same designer heels she had worn to the custody hearing. Her mugshot appeared beside Garrett's on every news broadcast. Mascara running, hair disheveled, eyes wild with the particular terror of someone whose carefully constructed fantasy had collapsed. And the pregnancy that had been announced with such fanfare, it never existed. Medical records revealed that Vanessa had falsified her condition to secure her position, betting everything on a man who was now radioactive. Eleanor Caldwell retreated to her mansion and refused all interviews. Her social calendar emptied overnight. Friends who had sought her favor for decades suddenly discovered prior commitments when she called. The Caldwell name, once synonymous with old money and establishment respectability, became a punchline and a warning. But for Meredith, the only victory that mattered came 6 weeks later, in a courtroom very different from the one where she had lost everything. Judge Patricia Winters presided over the new custody hearing with the kind of stern impartiality that had been noticeably absent before. She reviewed the evidence. She heard testimony from Agent Cole and Catherine and the other women. She watched the recording from the Stanford Hotel, where Garrett had threatened Meredith on camera. And then she issued her ruling. Full custody of the minor children, Emmett and Nora Caldwell, is hereby awarded to Meredith Caldwell. Mr. Garrett Caldwell is denied all visitation pending the resolution of criminal proceedings. Furthermore, this court orders the immediate release of all frozen marital assets and awards compensatory damages for the financial and emotional harm inflicted upon the petitioner. Meredith heard the words as if from a great distance. Full custody, released assets, compensatory damages. She had won. Suzanne squeezed her hands so hard it hurt. The gallery behind her erupted in whispers and murmurs, but Meredith's eyes were fixed on the doorway, where a court officer was bringing in two small figures in matching sweaters. Emmett saw her first. His face lit up with recognition, and he began to wriggle in the officer's arms, reaching toward her with both hands. "Mama," he said. "Mama." It was the first word he had ever spoken, and he said it again. Mama, Mama, Mama. Meredith was on her feet, moving toward her children, gathering them into her arms with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her chest. Nora pressed her face into Meredith's neck, her tiny fingers clutching her mother's hair. I am here, Meredith whispered. I am here. Oh, I am never letting go again. The months that followed were not easy. Healing never was. Meredith moved to a small coastal town in Maine, far from Greenwich and its memories. She bought a modest house with a view of the ocean, nothing like the estate she had left behind, but infinitely more hers. She went back to work, using her accounting background to help other women uncover hidden assets during divorce proceedings. It was not glamorous. It did not pay what Garrett's hedge fund had paid, but it mattered. The twins grew, as twins do. They took their first steps on a beach at sunset. They said their first full sentences surrounded by cardboard boxes in their new living room. They learned to laugh and cry and trust in a home where nobody raised their voice or slammed doors or made their mother cry. Meredith still had nightmares sometimes. She still checked the locks 3 times before bed. She still flinched at the sound of expensive cologne or saw Garrett's face in strangers on the street. But she was healing. Slowly. Imperfectly. Persistently. One afternoon in early spring, she sat on her front porch watching Emmett and Nora chase seagulls across the sand. A truck pulled into her driveway, and a man stepped out, carrying a toolbox. His name was Owen Hartley. He was a widowed carpenter with kind eyes and calloused hands, and a daughter named Sophie, who was the same age as the twins. He had come to fix her porch railing, which had been wobbling since she moved in. He did not ask about her past. He did not push for details or expect explanations. He just fixed the railing, played with the children for an hour, and asked if maybe he could come back sometime. I would like that, Meredith said, and she meant it. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. She looked at the screen and felt nothing at all. Garrett Caldwell sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. She turned off the phone and looked back at her children, at the ocean, at the man loading his tools into his truck with a wave and a smile. He took everything from me, she thought, my trust, my security, my belief that the world was fair. But he could not take them, and he could not take me. Owen waved from his truck. Sophie pressed her face against the window, waving at the twins. Emmett ran toward the porch, sand flying from his tiny sneakers. Mama, he shouted. Mama, I found a shell. He held it up like a treasure, his face bright with joy, and Meredith felt something bloom in her chest. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, something stronger. Peace. She pulled her son into her arms and kissed his sandy cheek. It is beautiful, she said. Let us find more. And together, hand in hand, they walked toward the water. The tide was coming in. The future was wide open. And for the first time in a very long time, Meredith Caldwell was not afraid.